So, Chris, the reading for today's session, we are starting with section 6. Coming out of those first 5 sections where the I and the you were everywhere, and you were just so aware of the poet, the I, speaking directly to you, whoever you are, picking up this poem and reading it now. Starting with section 6, the you begins to transfigure itself in some interesting ways. So in section 5, he had addressed the soul. I believe in you, my soul. In section 6, he begins to address the grass itself. Tenderly I will use you, curling grass. And one of the things we begin to sense as we were talking about in our previous conversations is that Whitman begins to set up this equation between the I and the you that makes us question every time we hear that you in the poem now. Well, yeah, he's talking to the grass, but in some way, I'm the grass, and he's the grass. He's talking to his soul, but in some way, I am his soul. So the you keeps taking on this amazing double sense, even when it appears in the poem to be addressing one thing specifically. The way he set the poem up, we're always hearing it equally addressing us.
And this question of who you are, who I am, is what fueled our conversation that we'll continue right now.
In our last session, we touched on Whitman's creation of these 2 central characters, the I and the you, and the conversation, the discourse that will take place between them over the course of Song of Myself. Ed, I want to ask you to begin, how does he go about creating these characters?
Yeah, well, the creation of these characters seems to me another part of the amazing mystery we were talking about when we were talking about where this poem came from. I think one thing that Whitman latched onto early in the writing of the poem is the nature of the book itself, the physical object of the book itself, and how that plays into his manipulation of those 2 pronouns, the I and the you. Because the book, that physical thing, or virtual thing as it is in today's world, but certainly as Whitman thought of it, it was always a physical object that the reader would be in contact with. There would be an actual physical contact as your fingers would move down the page. And he talks about that. There's the part of Song of Myself toward the end when he says, "Listener up there, hear you. What have you to confide to me? Look in my face while I snuff the sidle of the evening. Talk honestly, for no one else hears you, and I stay only a minute longer." And if we flip the page, we see that we've got about a minute left to finish Song of Myself. We are looking literally into the face of that leaf of grass, into the face of that page. He speaks up off the page at us, where the listener who is literally up there. And then when he says, "Hear you," right, he's positioning the reader physically over the book. And everything, it seems to me, that Whitman does with the I and the you, and ultimately with that 3rd character that we haven't really talked about yet, but we certainly will, that what he calls my soul, it's all related to that physical object of the book. Whitman, in the mid-19th century, is writing that poem, sitting at a certain place, and as a bookmaker, he's well aware, a printer, a typesetter, he's well aware of all the physicality, the materiality of the book. And for him, he knows that the you he's speaking to, you, the reader, will be someone who is alive when he's dead. And his poems become most effective, in a way, when they're read after his death, because he's projecting that reader sometime in the future. So that we experience, when we read the poem, this uncanny sense that he has already conceived of us before we were here.
Because he's speaking to the future, isn't he?
He is speaking to the future, which becomes our present, and then he slips into his past, which was his present. But it's that continual manipulation, that movement of past and present. He does it with verb tense, he does it with address, that he keeps bringing you into this moment of the present. For me, two of Whitman's key words that we always have to think about and look at are those little words here and now, those indicative words that keep shifting. For Whitman, the here and the now are the scene of writing, right? The page that he wrote on. For us, the here and the now are the scene of reading. But the scene of reading and the scene of writing, through the mastery of Whitman in handling the kind of what he would call in Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, the ferrying back and forth between the future and the present and the past. The here and the now become, for us, a very material thing. But as we communicate with Whitman, we're communicating across that border of life and death, right? And Whitman himself was communicating across that border of life and death. He was speaking to the yet unborn. And so the soul becomes that strange material spiritual figure. We are material beings. Whitman was a material being. We don't exist in the same material world at the same time in the same forms, but Whitman would say, I knew you'd be there. I knew you'd be breathing. I knew you'd have eyes. I knew you'd be reading this. And so for Whitman, the soul, in a way, comes to be those material readers of the future, those readers who continue the work of interpreting, thinking about, moving the poem forward. And in a way, when he's talking about soul, he's always talking about that idea that the one real faith, I think, that Whitman has is a faith that there will be people breathing, living, occupying material bodies in the future. And because of that, he knows there will be an afterlife. There will be a life after death.
And the soul is what's carrying those people from the past into the future, or making possible that communication.
Yeah. It's and in some odd way, as we are reading Song of Myself, we become Whitman's soul. We become that projected, at the time Whitman wrote, non-material spiritual essence that he knew someday would be there. And there will be readers after us, long after we're dead.
Do you think that you, which we can think of in these larger ways, at any moment was also a particular you? Was there someone that he found himself addressing as he went forward, or was that too private a matter for us to ever glean?
Yeah, I think it shifts in Whitman's poetry over time. I think in the Calamus poems, there, at least in some of the Calamus poems, there probably were particular yous that generated that pronoun. But I think in general, and certainly in Song of Myself, Whitman really discovered what I spoke of earlier as the promiscuous you, that the way that works in English, so that in English we don't have to decide, as translators of Song of Myself have to do. We don't have to decide whether this is a formal usage or an informal usage, whether it's a plural or a singular. That the you just keeps shifting. It keeps absorbing whatever audience is there to be absorbed. And we can hear that you at times as an extremely intimate one-on-one you, and at other times as an extremely embracing universal use, speaking to the entire world.
And there's really no precedent, is there, for this use of the you before Whitman makes this discovery, is there?
It not only no precedent for it, but no antecedent to it. You know, I mean, there have certainly been poets who have tried this magic again and have succeeded to various degrees, but I think no one ever quite captured what Whitman did by projecting a you that makes us feel ourselves to be material embodiments of something that in Whitman's time was a purely idealistic spiritual projection. I know you will be there, Whitman says. You do not exist now. You do not exist in the material world, but you will exist in the material world, and I'm writing for you.
And this is a kind of answer to the sometimes conventional notion that Whitman's I is some egotistical I. In fact, it's an I who is in direct communication with the you who may not even exist yet.
That's right.
So it's always about relationship rather than the imposition of an idea.
Yeah, the I and the you that continue to slip into each other. You know, as we read this poem, we hear ourselves addressed as the you, but we're also speaking the I as we read it aloud. There's a continual merging and slipping between the I and the you, and as we were talking about earlier, with the first word of the poem being I, moving to the last word of the poem being you, it's that continual transference of energy. And in fact, we can even think of it as a transference of materiality from the I that writes the poem to the you that now embodies it and reads it.
Which is why we have structured this course as a conversation.
Right.
An I and a you.
Or an I and a you. Good.
Ed, thinking back on our conversation about the main characters of this poem, the I and the you, it occurred to me that when you were talking about Whitman's soul as the carrier of information from the past into the present and into the future, that you're really talking about the democratic imagination, aren't you?
Yeah, the soul is, in some sense, the democratic imagination as Whitman understood it, which was an imagination that was continually evolving and pushing. I mean, I always think of the Whitman notion of the life itself, let's say, the thing that goes beyond any particular I or any particular you. You and I embody life right now in these material bodies. 50 years from now, these material bodies will not be here. There will be material bodies here that do not exist in the world today, that will be breathing and talking and reading. And
bearing some of our inflections.
And bearing some of our inflections, yes. So that you have the notion in Whitman that this thing we call soul is what we might think of as the life force that exists only literally right in this sliver of a moment we call now. Doesn't exist a second ago, and it doesn't exist a second in the future. It exists right at this moment. And it shifts continually, transforms from the materials that are dispersing and the materials that are coming together, so that it's always there. And so in Whitman's mind, a democratic imagination would be one that would be evolving continually through that moment of now into the future. I mean, I always think of Whitman, thinking of the American Constitution, would very clearly have always seen that as a document in progress, a document that was evolving. And that as the now moves forward, more and more discriminations and biases get knocked down, and we open ourselves to a more and more democratic future. Think of how he wrote Leaves of Grass. It's continually revising, continually opening it up again.
Democracy, like the poem, these are not static institutions. They are constantly changing.
Yeah, yeah, because in Whitman's mind, democracy is anything but an institution.
Yeah.
It is a way of thinking, a way of imagining, a way of living. To have a democratic imagination takes us far out of the realm of thinking of living in a democracy. It takes us into the realm of living democratically in every phase of our life, from the way we love to the way we think to the way we interact to the way we eat to every aspect of our lives has to be questioned according to the democratic imagination. Starting with section 6, the U begins to transfigure itself in some interesting ways. So in section 5, he had addressed the soul. I believe in you, my soul. In section 6, he begins to address the grass itself. Tenderly I will use you, curling grass. Always hearing it equally addressing us.
And this question of who you are, who I am, is what fueled our conversation that will continue right now.
In our last session, we touched on Whitman's creation of these two central characters, the I and the you, and the conversation.
So, Chris, the reading for today's session, we are starting with section 6. Coming out of those first 5 sections where the I and the you were everywhere, and you were just so aware of the poet, the I, speaking directly to you, whoever you are, picking up this poem and reading it now. I'm the grass, and he's the grass. He's talking to his soul, but in some way, I am his soul. So the you keeps taking on this amazing double sense, even when it appears in the poem to be addressing one thing specifically. The way he set the poem up, and one of the things we begin to sense as we were talking about in our previous conversations is that Whitman begins to set up this equation between the I and the you that makes us question every time we hear that you in the poem now. Well, yeah, he's talking to the grass, but in some way